Welcome to Frankly Speaking, the podcast on responsible business from Frank Bold, the European Public Interest law firm. I'm Richard Howitt, and after many years leading debates about responsible business in the European Parliament, I host our discussions about the very latest in corporate sustainability, sustainable finance, business and human rights. Today, a worker-centric approach to corporate human rights due diligence. A new report by the independent research organisation Swedwatch, based in Stockholm, critiques data-driven approaches to due diligence and shows how engagement with workers can be most effective and explores how that can be funded. The report is called Overdue Diligence, and I'm delighted that its author, Benjamin Claeson, is here to discuss it. Welcome to Frankly Speaking, Ben.
Thank you. It's very nice to be on here, so thanks for having us with you.
And we're also joined by one of the organisations who participated in the research from the Global South, Babul Akhter, General Secretary of the Bangladesh Garment and Industrial Workers Federation, BGIWF. Welcome, Babul.
Yeah, welcome. Hi.
Nice to meet you. First, Ben, where does your research suggest that current efforts towards corporate due diligence on human rights are falling short?
It's a pretty big question because there are pretty substantial gaps, and this is really what led us to start this research. But Swedwatch as an organization, we've been working for 20 years to support workers and communities to leverage due diligence processes to protect and promote their rights. And I think there are maybe two layers that I would want to highlight where we're seeing gaps in due diligence practices. One is in terms of the practices of companies themselves, common due diligence practices, from risks assessments to social audits and certification schemes all the way through grievance mechanisms are showing a lack of meaningful engagements with workers and communities, which means that it's very hard for workers and communities to leverage those processes to protect and promote their rights. I think if you look at mandatory due diligence laws, they might start to shift those standards, but it's a big if, and we can get to that later depending around how they're enforced. There was a report the other day from the World Benchmarking Alliance which said that only 10% of companies right now are assessing human rights risks in their supply chain. So, the practices are pretty limited, and we can get into some of the specifics there. The other layer, though, that I think is really fundamentally undermining worker-centered approaches, and also I would add into that dimension community-centered approaches for communities who are impacted by global value chains, is that human rights defenders, labor rights defenders, and workers and communities, when they speak out, they face pretty severe protection risks right now. And I'm speaking with kind of broad strokes here, but if they speak out, they are often attacked, they're intimidated, they're harassed. We're also seeing a growing collusion between companies and governments where to repress dissent around these global value chains. And so we see organizations who speak out, including worker representative organizations who are get registration revoked, are arrested, or get sort of buried in administrative compliance. And so the confluence of those two very poor standards when it comes to meaningful engagements of workers and communities, and then also these heightened states of civic space restrictions and protection issues that face workers and communities. We're seeing pretty severe gaps in terms of accurately assessing risks, and then also securing remedy for workers and communities who have been impacted. And that's what led us into this report, to better understand how do we address those gaps.
We will deal with the most egregious examples that you've just given, but there'll be a lot of people and companies listening who are not actively collaborating with governments in those sorts of life and death situations, but are very busy at their desks and really, from their point of view, feel they have to rely on data-driven approach, working with software and data companies to do the investigation and due diligence, and think, how on earth could we really engage with workers and communities, given the fact that there are so many around the world at different points in our supply chain. But in your report, you've got some very good examples where it is happening. So can you quote to us some of those examples?
Yeah, I will do. And I want to maybe preface that by saying when you look at what those data-driven approaches are measuring, it's not useless, but it verges on it. So if you look, for example, there was an OECD report which came out last year and it looked at ESG ratings products. Of the metrics which measure human rights impacts, over 80% are self-reported by companies. So you're never going to get a very accurate prediction of risks when you're relying on those data products. On the flip side, there are several worker community-driven models that are available to companies to engage with. There's one case in our report which comes from an organization called Electronics Watch. So they work with their member public procurers to address cases of abuse within electronic supply chains, and they do that through a worker-driven monitoring and remedy model where they have a network of organizations who are working with workers impacted in different factories and in some cases mines who are within electronic supply chains, and they work to monitor cases of abuse through independent worker-driven organizations. And then when the cases of abuse are identified, they would then engage their member public purchasers to address and try to support workers to reach remedy. So I would say there are a range of civil society networks that are independent of industry that are available to companies to engage with. These are really what are going to drive change and what are going to create a much more accurate assessment of risk within their supply chain. So it's not only about the moral doing the right thing, but it's also about understanding where their increasing legal risks might be within their supply chains and where there also threats to their supply chains that arise when conflict occurs when they're not addressing these risks preemptively. So there are toolkits. It depends on the sector and it depends on the geography we're talking about, but a range of civil society organizations and networks provide toolkits to engage with companies. And I would say it's far more effective to support those kinds of worker-driven, community-driven models than it is to rely on these big data set models which are really devoid of connection from workers and communities. And if you think about the most vulnerable to abuse, these are the least likely to have their voices heard when you're relying on these data sets that are not driven by any sort of meaningful engagement strategy. Women within factories, for example, who are least likely to be able to speak out if there is some sort of audit, they're going to be kind of silenced in those data sets. So working with women-led organizations, working with networks that support them, I think it's far more effective for those companies.
And so often only in the English language as well.
Right.
That Electronics Watch example is a great one because it shows that for the companies, they collaborate with each other to do it. So they're sharing the burden and the cost.
Right.
And just as we heard from Aldi Group in a recent podcast, by using a third party, it can be easier to build up trust with the workers and the communities. Now, Babul, the case example involving you in the report is really pertinent. Before we look at that, just give us a general statement about what is the position of the workers in Bangladesh.
Thank you for your question. The worker situation in Bangladesh is not good. In Bangladesh, we have 42 sector, one of them in the garment sector. I will share about the garment sector worker situation. Yeah, more than 4 million workers are working here and more than 3,500 garments industry in Bangladesh. So as a worker, our is the main challenge or problem workers is wage. Wage is still is low in the world, is $100 per month. This is the one thing, and worker and the workplace working condition is not good still, but it's day by day are changing. Every week they work 6 days, and sometime when come the shipment date, then they also are working then and weekend. They cannot enjoy their leave easily, and harassment, sexual harassment, and job security is still this is happening here. We have no social security system for the workers. This is the another problem. And if I say as a overall is the workers freedom of association as like ILO Convention 87 and 98, a worker cannot enjoy this. Trade union formation is very difficult, and trade union registration process is also very difficult. And if any and if genuine worker try to function their inhuman activities, they also face a lot of the problem, and sometimes they face the overproduction target. Sometimes they sacked from the job. Sometimes they face the false criminal case, etc. And sometimes also management hired the muscleman also for harassment. This is the general situation here. And our grievance system is a nationally grievance system is not easy. It is very difficult for justice.
I do know, Babul, that you've been personally imprisoned for campaigning for rights for workers. That list of low wages, very long working hours, no holidays, no sickness benefits, harassment, all too often we've heard that, not just in Bangladesh, but around the world. Benjamin, much of your report is aimed at funders, not just asking for money, but identifying how it can be spent. Could you briefly summarize your recommendations on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think to start with, we're facing a pretty severe funding cliff right now. When we released the report, we were estimating that around 0.62% of aid and philanthropy are going to support efforts to hold businesses accountable to human rights and environmental standards. Since then, we've seen a few major philanthropies start to close doors or shift focus, and so we're heading towards a real crisis moment for the field. But then also within that, there are pretty substantial gaps, right? So one good example is worker and community organizing. This is something which is, foundational to any strategy for workers and communities to leverage due diligence procedures. It enables them to build power, to build consensus about what they want to advocate for, to build capacity, to leverage these laws. And yet it only accounts for 2% of that small sliver of funding that's available. Another good example is protection funding. I talked a lot about protection issues before. You mentioned arrests, threats, attacks that are common in many countries. Yet of the available funding, only 0.11% goes to support organizations to deal with those protection threats. So there are pretty substantial gaps. The other thing I would say is it's not going to the right people, right? So Indigenous-led organizations, women-led organizations, organizations in the Global South are much less likely to have access to philanthropy and aid to support the communities and workers to hold businesses accountable. And what our report showed is that those gaps, both in terms of total quantity of funding, but also in terms of the organizations and strategies that aren't being funded, really have a massive difference in terms of how workers and communities are able to leverage these laws and seek justice if a harm has occurred or prevent harms from occurring ideally in the first place. So in our report, we found there are several examples of very positive examples of funders who are doing this, who are supporting workers at the frontline organizations that are embedded within communities, part of those communities, with long-term funding to strengthen their support and the ability to leverage these laws. So the models are out there. The question now is about channeling more resources to those models.
We'll just quote the Wallace Global Fund, the Ford Foundation, Loudis Foundation, and the Freedom Fund, which you give as positive examples, case examples in the report about how you do this. You do also tackle some of the big questions about raising more money, many of which are drawn from the debates that take place in the tax justice movement. But you also talk about mini levies on companies in specific markets so that companies themselves contribute to the cost of doing this. If you're a company, you might say that the role of worker representation is in the trade unions, and trade unions are funded by the workers. They're not funded by the companies. What would you say to that criticism from companies?
Look, I think it depends on what you're talking about, and this is going to be sector specific. But what I'll say, and the Accord model that we were referencing earlier is a very good example where you have a model in Bangladesh and now in Pakistan as well, where the brands are contributing to addressing the grievances that are identified by worker-driven monitoring, and then funds are allocated by brands into a pot of money that can address, and build safety within, electrical safety and buildings. Babul can speak to this a lot more than I. That's one practical example, and that's, there are 5 others that are following that model around the world. And what this does for companies, investing in worker-driven or community-driven monitoring in particular, and their capacity to leverage due diligence procedures, is it makes sure that issues are identified before they escalate into broader conflicts and before that they create legal and financial risk for companies. And that's far better for companies who have sectors at risk in their supply chain, because it means that they can address them before you have severe grievances that have been identified, and so you're less likely to have long-term conflicts that threaten supply chains. So I'd say this is also not just like a moral question for companies to support, but it's also one that is in their financial and interest. The other thing I'd say is, right now, and I mentioned the ESG rating service market size. If you look at investors, they also have a big role to play here, where the ESG rating service market size is 80 times that of total global foundation funding for research and documentation in this field. And yet 80% of the metrics, as I said earlier, are self-reported by companies. If I'm an investor and I want to responsibly invest and assess risks where my investments might be contributing to human rights and environmental claims, I think a far more effective use of those resources would be to channel to funds that are independently supporting workers and communities to organize. You're going to get a far more accurate picture to inform how you employ your active stewardship models.
We've had pretty trenchant criticism in this podcast already of data providers and ESG ratings agencies. Do come on. If you're listening and like to come on and give a different view, you're very welcome. Now, Babul, Rana Plaza, factory fire, over 1,000 people killed. And Benjamin has just referred to the Accord, the collective project that followed, where brands got together to not just to redress what had happened, but to try and prevent future such disasters. I can't have you on the podcast because you were there and because you've been involved and not ask you, how has the Accord gone? Has it realised what its hopes were? Tell us.
Rana Plaza, it was a very big disaster and industrial accident in the Bangladesh, and more than 1,100 plus worker is dead, and a lot of worker is still suffering the problem. So after Rana Plaza, actually brand and national and international trade union take initiative and from the Accord. It was a legal binding things. So it was a very helpful for the workers' rights in Bangladesh, and Accord changed a lot of things. Accord saved our workers' life also, because our factory before Rana Plaza, our lot of factory was in the residential area, sometimes residential building. Now after Rana Plaza, when Accord started to work, then lot of factories shift from the industrial zone. So it was a very positive for the our garments industry. I could follow 3 things only: construction safety, electric safety, and fire safety. Now is no more Accord. So from the 2022, now is the RMC Sustainability Council. Some brands sign Accord, some brand not. So is Accord, and another side some American brand, they sign Alliance. So Alliance is American, but that was not legal binding. That was voluntary. So Accord was a legal binding things. So now is no Accord, no Alliance. Now is RHC are working here. RHC capacity and Accord capacity is different. Accord capacity was a very strong and neutral position, because there was only 2 groups, brand and trade union. Now RHC is brand, trade union, and manufacturer. So now I think the Bangladesh is a RMG association, is a BGMA, and BKMA is very powerful. So RSC are not working I think properly. I am also RH board of director, but I see in the last few meeting actually BGME leaders are trying to take advantage and they want to capture the RH activities.
That is one of the great challenges, that if you're talking about workers at the local level, whether it's Bangladesh or anywhere else, and the big corporations with all of their employees and with all of their money, it's very difficult to have a dialogue which is a dialogue of equals. It's very difficult to have a partnership, and that's not deliberate by the companies. It's just a fact of life. Have you found any ways of overcoming that?
Our parliament, more than 30% was garments owners, and among the 300 our parliament member, and more than 60% was the businessmen in our parliament. So, but no any level leader in our parliament. Balance is difficult here. Is Bangladesh? We have one bad practice. If we raise our voice for worker rights and go to our government or BGMA, nobody listen us. If I go to Grant or ILO or international any community, then actually our government say, okay, we'll fix this. I think you know the ILO roadmap. You know, last time is 5 country, Pakistan and some European country complain against our Bangladesh.
It's a great example, that which a lot of people in the companies will
Yeah.
welcome and perhaps don't hear. To deal directly with Swedwatch's report, they're talking about worker-centric due diligence. And I know that you've been involved in cooperating and dialogue with H&M, the fashion retailer. Could you talk a bit about what you've been doing there and how it's worked?
Yeah, actually H&M have one agreement with Industry All Global Union and IF Metal. I think IF Metal in Swedish on biggest trade union confederation. So I am also part with this agreement. And under this agreement in Bangladesh, we formed the National Monitoring Committee. I am also committee NMC member. So dialogue is very difficult, because sometimes we've seen if any H&M supplier factory, they torture to worker or they stop the union activities, then we try to talk with the sometimes H&M, but justice are not come. I have one example. Is one H&M supplier factory when we organize worker for trade union formation and we apply for trade union registration, then the factory management terminate all union leader. Then I complain to H&M, I complain to NMC for justice and remedy. But after 2 years we wait, then H&M say, okay, the worker is correct, now we'll see this. Then after 2 years we resolve this issue. So actually brand have, multinational company have a lot of policy, but not implementing or not following this by their supplier. So when the multinational company or European brand representative come to Bangladesh, they talk with the factory management, top management, and sometimes they talk with the worker. When they talk with the worker, then they take a top management with them. So front of the top management, worker cannot freely speak or frankly speak with the brand, with the monitoring team. So it's my opinion and my comments. If the brand representative go to the worker home, then they will get the real history. They will see the worker situation. They will understand the worker want. So this is happening. Actually, our labor law and brand policy, this is a different thing. So, but sometimes their supplier, they are not following labor law, but they are showing we are following the brand guidelines. But actually, sometimes this is the paperwork. They maintain a lot of paper and document. If anyone can go, then they will show this. We have a lot of document, but actually, genuine things is difference.
Can I go to Ben again? In the report, you talk about CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, as an opportunity. But then you speak about the reliance on voluntary self-disclosure by companies, as you've already said in the podcast. But under the new legislation, you've got European sustainability reporting standards, which are mandatory for companies to report on, including ones on workforce in supply chain and affected communities. And you've also got the requirements in the reporting rules for independent audit and assurance. So that's not voluntary, that's binding. Why is that not good enough?
I mean, if you take the last bit, if you take independent audit and assurance, I think that sector, there are some pretty significant flaws with the practices within independent audit and assurance sector. I mean, coming from conflicts of interest in terms of who are the providers there and who are their, the purchasers of their services, very poor, methodologies. So for example, the data that they get comes from pre-announced audits where, the management of factories are aware of the visit and can pre-prep workers. We had a report from Pakistan, for example, where workers were saying that they had been instructed to lie on audits. So audits, the auditing industry has been, there are very well documented cases where it misses pretty severe human rights impacts and risks of impacts. And so the kind of data that is going to be reported on, there are questions about how accurate and useful that data is, which is why it's so important to have independent worker and community-driven monitoring, so that they can also leverage these laws and produce their own data. So when you talk about the power imbalances, when you're talking to Babul a second ago, the power imbalances between worker organizations and brands and factories, I think the way that you address that is there are resources for support services to worker representative organizations and community-based organizations, which can help them to participate on more equal footing, providing independent data, for example, or supporting them to take cases to court at the same time as they're in dialogue with the company. All those kinds of support services, when they happen in confluence, are typically when workers and communities can have leverage. I would say, though, there are going to be big questions about whether there are, what look like quite sophisticated data models coming in to meet some kind of CSDDD compliance standards or NCSRD compliance standards, but that those data sets are devoid from reality of the experience that Babul is talking about, where you have audits and you have reports about surveys of workers that are completely missing huge impacts that workers and communities are facing. So I think the challenge moving forward, particularly given the way that some of the the CSDDD was deregulated in the omnibus, is how it's enforced. And without resourcing workers and communities to independently advocate within due diligence processes, I think you're likely to see more of a compliance-oriented approach rather than one which is really centered on the true experience of workers and communities.
Babul, I know that you have been following the CSDDD debate in Europe. What does it look like from a Bangladeshi perspective?
Actually, CSDDD and due diligence and others initiative, European initiative, it is my opinion. Actually, we need to compare with our national level law. How will compare with our level law? So our level law our labor law is not as strong. So we need to change our labor law, and some point need to add with our labor law. Then we need a implementation. Then we need a information, and we need also share with our workers community and workers leader about CS triple D system. So actually our leader, our factory-based worker, our factory-based trade union leader, and trade union federation leader, not actually about this. If we want to use this policy, before that we need to know about this. Still we are new about this. Yeah. So we need to understand clearly this. Not only me and others organization and sometimes workers leader, and an interesting matter, our government officer as a labor ministry office, or they don't know about this. And I also talk with some factory management. They also not aware about this. So this is actually a new things for Bangladesh. We need to understand this policy, and then we'll use these tools for better workers' benefit.
And in the Swedwatch report, it talks about the importance of the EU due diligence navigator, which is meant to inform not just governments from countries worldwide, but stakeholders within them. We're nearly at time, Babul. So last question I'm going to put to both of you, brief answer, I'm afraid. But what is your message to European companies listening to this broadcast?
Yeah, actually, my message for European brand: please increase your production for our country, and please increase the price. As I know, price is low, and my another message: please come to Bangladesh and visit the worker house. Then you will think what worker need, and please ensure living wage and freedom of association at your supplier factory. This is my message.
Thank you. Simple but very clear. And Benjamin, much of your report is aimed at governments and funders, but I'd like to give you a last chance. What's your message to the companies, the European companies?
I would say it's similar. It's collaborate with civil society and worker representative organizations, trade unions or civil society organizations that support workers and communities are very well networked and structured. Collaborate with those independent networks and structures. It's going to create a far more accurate understanding of risks within your supply chain. And there are many tools that are out there and available. We're in an era now where civic space restrictions mean that you're far less likely to get an understanding of what actual risks are because people are afraid to speak up and are targeted when they do so. So unless you're actively, meaningfully engaging with trade unions, with civil society organizations, you're never going to have a good understanding of the risks that you have within your supply chain that you're contributing to grave abuses and harms. So that would be my pitch.
In this podcast, we've heard from the Swedwatch report that due diligence with local actors is an investment, and it prevents worse human rights abuses and reputational risk to the company. We've heard the accord was successful in Bangladesh, but has finished and has perhaps not spread as fast as perhaps many of us thought 10 years and more ago that it would around the world as a model. We've heard that sometimes grievance procedures run by companies can allow workers to get their grievances heard in a way that local legal structures and local organisations can't. So that's definitely a thumbs up for what some of the companies are doing. We've heard about the example of H&M and the framework agreement with the industrial trade union federation. But even with that, local barriers are put up, which saw in Babul's case 2 years of waiting for dialogue to be able to take place. And at the end, we heard a really clear message, both from Ben and from Babul, to companies, which is one, pay a price that allows a living wage to be paid, and secondly, go to the countries and don't just go around with the senior managers. Go to and meet workers in their homes, and you'll be given a warm welcome, I think, is what Babul said, as well as making sure that you get the correct information. We have come to the end of our podcast today, and I'd like to thank very much Benjamin Claeson and Babul Akhter for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
You've been listening to Frankly Speaking, the Frank Bold podcast on responsible business. Find out more about Frank Bold's Responsible Companies section on our website, and please give us your feedback on our LinkedIn page or by commenting via your podcast provider, where we hope you will also share the conversation and give this podcast a 5-star rating. And remember, you can watch us on our YouTube channel too. Thank you again to Babul and to Benjamin, and to all of you for listening. Do join us next time.